Hey there. My name is Benjamin Krause. I am the founder here of disabledveterans.org, and I wanted to circle around here after all the hubbub this week about the anthrax vaccine memo, the now infamous anthrax vaccine memo. I wanted to talk with you all about what we found after things evolved over this week and to kind of circle in with basically kind of a conclusion. We know soup to nuts here that the anthrax memo surfaced over the weekend, that it became viral. One of the individuals who I consider a friend of mine forwarded it to me and asked me if it was authentic. Of course, we started to then have to look at it, right, to see what we thought. And myself, I'm an attorney and a journalist, and spend a lot of time authenticating things and understanding where they come from and sourcing documents and stories and tracking that down for my readers on disabledveterans.org, and also, of course, in my work as an attorney. So I spend a lot of time doing this and have friends that do it as experts. And we ended up, taking a good look at this and ended up concluding, of course, as you know from the earlier article, that it was an authentic memo, that it essentially says what it says. It's signed. It appears to be authentic. It has a cert. And we were able to, at least get to the bottom of the memo being a real memo, not a scam, not a fake, not a fraud, but a real memo. And that then we realized that there was some brouhaha brewing about it, and the trolls came out, and I wanted to walk through this because it occurred to me through talking with another individual that what we saw here was very similar to what veterans deal with the disability compensation and with the DoD. And so what we end up with is kind of a thing that we know is more or less true, but the knee-jerk reaction of the institution is to deny immediately in the most harshest language imaginable, and then gradually kind of walk it back. So I wanted to show you what we realized here this week, because it's very similar to what veterans experience when they get a disability. And you go in for the disability. I'm no different than many, where I filed numerous different injuries, even some that I believe are possibly related to anthrax and my reaction to it, and everything was denied with the exception of one thing. I got 10%. And then over the course of the next almost 15 years, I had to fight, even became an attorney to finally win my case. And then I won, and now I'm at 100% permanent in total, and I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to do that. But begrudgingly, it took me becoming an attorney to be able to win my own case. Imagine that. And even then, I'm fighting for the correct effective date, so it never ends. But what ends up, what we realize here is that we have a situation where information came out. The DoD, came after it. I believe the institution tried to spin it, and they, I'll get into that here in a second. So essentially, here's the memo. I have a great friend of mine, Francis White, who's going to summarize this at the end of this clip. And basically, it is what it says it is. It's a memo. It's written tasking order. Nothing fancy. This isn't written by VA attorneys or DoD attorneys. This is a master sergeant probably somewhere in Korea, and they wanted to identify veterans or service members rather who were possibly affected by what they believe is a bad batch. And then he highlights that they may be able to get some possible veterans benefits. Right? Seems pretty innocuous to me. Not a big deal. But when you read all the brouhaha about it, you would think, man, this is like scorched earth here. What exactly happened? So we know here that it's certified. It says valid. What is this? It's certainly not completely baloney. So I wanted to take a look. I'll get into the memo in a bit with Francis, but let's take a look at the news and how the news evolved. So I initially published the story here, and we exposed that it was at least authentic, right? Meaning that it more or less is what it says it is. It's a memorandum. It probably came from the Army, and here, hey, look, it's a DoD, it's certified, right? So we know more or less that it's beyond repudiation, and it is what it is. There may be errors in it or something, but it more or less is what it says it is. Then we ended up first with a this is what I had seen initially. So this is from Francisco Urena on Facebook. He comes out, it's a scam. And I was like, well, who is this guy? And realized, oh my gosh, he's the secretary of the Massachusetts Department of Veterans Services. So that's the equivalent of the state version of the VA that they have in every state. So he came out, looked at the memo, apparently a screenshot of the memo, and didn't look any further into it, and then concludes, it's a scam. Don't share your personal information. This is not how VA claims are filed. Well, it's not what it says it's from the Army. It has nothing to do with filing VA disability whatsoever. the purpose of it is to find soldiers who took the anthrax vaccine. That's what it says. So not a scam, at least, because we know it's an authentic memo. Then we have the, let's see here. So that came out. Then we have the next story. This is then after I published what I published it was authentic. Then this came out. Again, another screenshot. You can't really authenticate much from a screenshot, especially from Facebook. Don't try to do that. It's probably not going to work out. And so what this person is talking about here, because of course they're saying Army memo spreads false information. Well, what's false in it? Well, we don't really know. According to this article, we just know that the memo's based off probably distorted and ultimately circulated online. Well, wait, so distorted information like what? And so you start to look at it. Well, this is a text from somebody who was named in the memo, a guy named Norris. And, so he explains here basically, like, I didn't actually write this memo, but my name was included without running it by me. Like, okay, so that obviously you didn't write it. Your name's not on it. Then he's researching and he says it's legit, but then he gets into it with his buddy, apparently, who shares it, which is, I'd be probably pretty frustrated about this. But yeah, he says it's illegitimate and done without his knowledge or permission. Well, illegitimate, like it's a memo and it's DoD certified. So what exactly is going on? And he says, between you and me, here's the original email. Poorly written and clearly states that it's not official yet. Oh, okay, but that doesn't mean the information's false. Unfortunately, an officer slapped my name and ran with it as a point of contact. Well, so what? He's not the person making the assertion. And we know that there's something going on. Those who have received the anthrax series at Fort Campbell. Okay, so something's up here. So, again, interesting. So what's going on? Well, after they published this, so this is by a company called Entercom, Connecting Vets, and it's a marketing company that is trying to break into the market, I think, for military.com as competition, something like that. They tend to be more kind of like parroting what I think the VA kind of wants people to say, if that makes sense. Perhaps they have a contract with the VA or something, who knows. But anyway, then the Army comes out, and the Army, they officially retract the memo, touting VA benefits to soldiers, etc., due to bad anthrax vaccines. And so here's what's interesting. So they go through this sequence, and of course, I don't know about you, but if you believe what, DHA is selling here, then I have oceanfront property in Arizona I'd love to sell you, for a great price, because, we know that the VA and the Army mislead people all the time. Just look at the evolution of, Agent Orange, and initially Agent Orange, was harmless. Then suddenly it's like, well, it might give you some zits, like chloracne or something. And then, you might get cancer, or you might get some other conditions, or have breathing problems. Okay, then you get diabetes. Your kids might get sick. Your kids might be missing parts of their spine. There's lots of problems. Wow, watch out for Agent Orange, right? And that only took 40 years to figure out. So at this point, we're at about year, what are we? Since the 20-year, we're at the 20-year mark. So I can assume that we're probably not going to get anywhere with what the Army's going to say about anthrax for at least another, 20 years, right? When the people start dying from old age, etc. So anyway, what they get into here is they say that, the information is false and completely without merit. And then the spokesperson continues, once the brigade discovered the error, the correct information was published to their soldiers. Well, what information? Well, we're not going to tell you. so apparently they didn't give them the Army Times. They refused to provide the Army Times with the additional information. So interesting. And then that aside, they do confess at the very bottom of the article, the potential side effects of vaccines, including anthrax, are generally mild and temporary. While the risk of serious harm is extremely small, there is a remote chance of a vaccine causing serious injury or death. It happens. Let me tell you, there is a vaccine court. It's very real. People die from this. And when I say this, I mean vaccines. It does happen. So it's important to keep that in mind. But right now, they don't believe there's a conclusive link. They think that it's, essentially harmless. We know a ton of veterans disagree, but, that's life at this point. So I think here's what's interesting about how the story evolves. So again, we go from scam to that, and then now we have, Stars and Stripes writes about it. Army, no VA benefits for false warning of bad anthrax vaccine. Oh, that doesn't make sense. It's kind of a poorly worded, title, but that happens. Now, they basically repeat the same thing in the Army Times story, but at the end, now this is interesting. So the quote from the spokesperson continues. So this part was omitted from the previous report. So they go into it and they say, basically, while the risk of serious harm is extremely small, there is a remote chance of vaccine causing permanent or causing serious injury or death. Writes Ed, and then she continues, in those rare cases, VA disability or death benefits may be granted. Okay, interesting. So again, the story evolves depending on who you read. And so they had a similar version of the story. Let's see. And then here we go, talking about how it needs to impact daily life. And so, well, that's an interesting, kind of variation that we see, telling people to, get with their VA representatives, etc. So it's a little bit of a different version. But it's important to just note that, we do have kind of an evolving story. And just like we had seen with, whether it's your disability benefits and, it's just like initial denial of everything, and then you fight for it, and then, okay, well, yeah. It happened or whatever. It evolves. So what we realize is that it's very possible that people might be affected. So then I guess the question is, what exactly is wrong? But basically, this isn't necessarily a false memo. This is information that's very real. There's something going on. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And then I wanted to also highlight one other thing before we jump into what Francis has to talk about. Basically, here's one of the examples that we're dealing with, and I want to jump right to the bottom. So the conclusion here talks about how the risk, and they are supposedly looking at disability among U.S. Army veterans vaccinated against anthrax. And so how do they determine this interesting thing? So looking at the conclusion, let's see what they conclude. Risk of disability separation from Army and receipt of compensation from the VA were not increased in association with prior exposure to AVA, so the anthrax vaccine, basically. This study provides evidence that vaccination against anthrax is not associated with long-term. What? So basically, they're relying on the receipt of VA benefits, which is a total joke in many instances, especially when it comes to these issues of anthrax, where they fight like hell regardless of what the medicine says. So they're relying on VA benefits and the receipt of those as to show some proof one way or the other that as evidence that anthrax doesn't cause long-term disability. Like, what a bunch of hogwash. So when you look at, what the objective actually is, the objective is to investigate the association between anthrax received while on active duty and subsequent disability determination by the Veteran Benefits Administration. It took them 40 years to figure out that Agent Orange caused all these problems. And you're going to tell me that the Army and these researchers are going to rely on the VA to be the arbiter of truth related to whether this causes disability? Like, people can be disabled of all kinds of things, but the VA won't acknowledge it. That doesn't mean that they're not disabled. It just means that the VA doesn't want to admit and pay for what they're entitled to. But let's not forget that the Department of Veterans Affairs used to be called the Bureau of War Risk Insurance until they realized the name wasn't quite as snazzy as they had hoped. So let's get real. But, that's the science, that we're dealing with here. It's a lot of voodoo and misdirection. But, at the end of the day, the science doesn't exactly say what they try to tell us it says. But, that's life. So anyway, I'm going to jump in, put on the clip here from Francis evaluating that. I want you to take a look and, come away with your own conclusion. But we think where there's smoke, there's fire. There's more information to be got. One thing that I wanted to also highlight here is that we do have an email that wanted to bring over here. So basically, here's what we have. And this is, something that was not included in the Army unit retraction, but it's the email that was forwarded by David, who's apparently the point of contact, the last name David. And the person says, our tasking order has been rescinded. Oh, okay. The originating information our S3 shop received was not vetted by the DOD. I apologize. Oh, so they didn't have permission from the DOD to write it down. So apparently that makes it false, right? Is that accurate? Does that make sense? So the DoD didn't give them permission to talk about it. Therefore, it's completely false and unfounded. No, that's not quite logical, right? Something can be true that the government doesn't want out, and that doesn't make it false, even if, they want us to believe it is. It'd be akin to like the Pentagon Papers being leaked or whatever. They're pissed because this got leaked, and it makes them look dumb. But that doesn't make the information false or fake or anything else that we see here. But it does mean that there's something going on, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. So here's a little bit from Frank about how to understand for your own, intellectual self-defense, how to understand and detect whether a memo like this is authentic. Take care.
Hello, my name is Francis White. I'm an attorney, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant. I hold a certification from CompTIA in SecPlus. One of the requirements for acquiring that certification, when I got it, was to understand the inner workings of the PKI program. Now, PKI is something that is used to digitally sign and or encrypt documents or email messages. In this case, I'm looking at the memo that purports to be signed by Patrick S. McGrath, Master Sergeant USA, S3 Ops, SGM, part of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Air Defense Artillery Regiment, 35th Air Defense Artillery Brigade in Korea. I was asked to review this document because there's a lot of confusion as to whether or not this document is authentic. And while I cannot speak to the authenticity of the information that is contained in this document, I can speak to the authenticity of the signature, and I will. And I'll show you how I know it is real. To begin with, if you click on the signature itself in the Adobe Acrobat or in the Adobe Reader document, the PDF, it will present this pop-up. This pop-up tells you that the signature is valid. The pop-up also tells you whether or not the document has been modified since the signature was applied. If you want to have additional information, click on Signature Properties. By looking at the signature properties, you can learn a few more things. You can learn what was used to create this document or apply the signature. In that case, it's under Advanced Properties. And you can see that it was applied during Adobe Acrobat Pro DC and this particular version number. It will also tell you that the hash algorithm is SHA-256. Additionally, you can look under here and you can see the certificate chain of the signature certificate itself. This signature certificate was issued to an individual by the name of Patrick Stephen McGrath II, who holds the DEERS number, that's Defense Eligibility and Enrollment and Reporting System number, of 124-231-0531. This certificate was issued by DoD Certificate Authority 32, and it was issued by the U.S. government. This digital signature itself is valid, and you can tell whether or not somebody's been playing games by looking at the validity period. It cannot exceed 3 years. In this case, it is valid from the 10th of August 2015 through the 10th of August 2018. The usage of this is a digital signature, and if you look at this particular word right here, non-repudiation, this means that this certificate exists so that once applied, the document cannot be repudiated. The signature itself is authentic. That doesn't mean that the information contained in the document is authentic, but it means that the signature is authentic. At the time the document was signed, at the time the signature was applied to the document, the application went out and it checked for an OSCP. It went out and it determined whether or not, it asked whether the certificate was still valid. And it was told it was still valid by this particular DoD device right here. Now, if whether the certificate remains valid to this day and has not been revoked, that remains to be seen as well. But at the time the certificate was applied to this document, it was valid. This document cannot be repudiated as having been signed authentically by this individual, Patrick Stephen McGrath II. Now, the certificate we can ascertain with absolute certainty whether or not it's valid, whether or not it's authentic, and whether or not it can be repudiated. And we know that it's valid, we know that it's authentic, and we know that it cannot be repudiated. As regards the information that is in the memo, that requires more of a legal analysis than does this, and it's a little bit more ambiguous. However, the individual who has signed this and who has purported to be Patrick Stephen McGrath II, who we know is Patrick Stephen McGrath II because he can't repudiate this, is putting his name to this in much the same way as you would put your name to a check or a contract. He's making a statement that this information in here is correct. So whether or not the information is correct, we can't know. And we cannot know with the certainty, one way or the other, that we do know with the certificate. So the reality is that there is a presumption, in my opinion, there is a presumption that the memo itself is authentic. It is a rebuttable presumption, which means someone will have to come in and show that it's not authentic. The signature cannot be shown to be unauthentic.